great. So want to begin by thanking Ms. Myhill for putting together a great packet and covering a lot of ground for us. This was a complex issue on a number of different levels because there is some crossover with the state, and we wanted to make sure that we dotted the I's and crossed the T's. But as we get started, I wanted to remind everybody why we're here in the first place. About a year ago, I had the opportunity to attend a meeting that was convened by Dr. Travis Gales at HHS. This was just a few weeks after having been freshly appointed as chair of this very important committee. And at that meeting, which was packed, there were representatives from Montgomery County Public Schools, public health officials from both the county as well as the state. School health nurses were there. Members of the Parent-Teacher Association were there. And the subject was vaping. And that work group had been convened with the support of my colleagues from the previous council, who already began to observe and identify the growing issue of vaping that has become an epidemic, particularly among our youth. And so there at that meeting, heard story after story of students who have asthma and did not feel comfortable using the restrooms in their own high schools because some of those restrooms were literally known as the vape rooms in some high schools. Stories of high school students who were purchasing these products and then selling them to middle school students. Stories of school administrators being totally overwhelmed, not quite sure knowing what to do because of the fact that these products are odorless and the fact that students can vape even in class, and it is very difficult to detect on a number of different levels. And I also heard, as we will hear once again from Dr. Gales, regarding the confirmation that although these products are marketed as somehow a safe alternative to cigarette use, we in fact know they are not. That they do, in particular, contain very high dosages of nicotine, and that is particularly true of products such as Juul. We also know that the tobacco industry, over the last 20 years, we had started to see a decline in the access of cigarettes, particularly among our juvenile population. We had begun to turn the curve as a nation on this issue. But in the last 10 years, because of the unregulation within this particular space of products, we have seen an exposure, and the marketing that gives the impression to our youth that this is a safe alternative. And so for all those reasons, we knew that there was something that had to be done, action that needed to be taken. And then, of course, we had a work session earlier this year, more formally, between our Education and Culture Committee and HHS Committee, where we heard about the ill effects of these products firsthand from the people that were in that meeting that I had the opportunity to attend earlier this year. So if we could just begin by Dr. Gales, if you could describe for us once again from a medical perspective why this issue is so important, why we must as a country but also local jurisdictions take action, and describe for us, if you will, what some of those medical issues are.
Good morning, and thank you, Chairman Albanos. My name is for the record, Travis Gales, County Health Officer and Chief of Public Health Services. Thank you for the opportunity to speak before you all today. As you mentioned, we have discussed this issue a number of times, and I will be brief, but hopefully comprehensive in terms of an overview as from the medical concerns and clinical concerns we have about exposures. So let me be very clear. I also speak from the perspective of a clinically trained pediatrician and a specialist in adolescent medicine. We have several concerns about pediatric exposure to nicotine products in general. So whether we're talking about cigarettes, we're talking about vaping devices, early exposure to nicotine can have significant impacts on the continued maturation and development of important parts of the adolescent brain. In particular, the area of concern is the prefrontal cortex. And as we talked in the working session that you mentioned, I won't get into the biochemistry and the neuroanatomy of it, but suffice to say that the prefrontal cortex is an important area of the brain that contributes significantly to executive functioning responsibilities. It's an emotional center. It helps us basically perform adulting activities in terms of being responsible, mature adults. That part of the brain continues to develop into the early 20s. It's speculated that that development continues till about the age of 25. Early exposure to nicotine can decrease the level of maturity in that brain product, that space, can impair the further development and complete development of that part of the brain. We also know that early exposure to nicotine can have increased impact on the level of addiction to nicotine, the level of withdrawal symptoms associated with nicotine should the individual stop. Research also has shown that there is increased early exposure to nicotine also increases an individual's initiation of other substances that may be more harmful in the short term compared to nicotine. And of significant note, one of the things that we were worried about, if you all recall from that initial meeting, work group meeting that you referenced in February of this year, is that we were noticing that, or there have been reports of students vaping and juuling who were losing consciousness and requiring naloxone to be administered. For any of us in the medical community and the non-medical community, we know that just using nicotine products should not cause that level of impairment. And so the concern was that anyone who was vaping potentially, but particularly those young persons, were exposed to other substances that could be more harmful in the short term. And particularly given our geographic location in the region, we know that there has been introduction of other substances into our drug supply that have caused significant impairment. Whether we're talking about synthetic cannabinoids, we're talking about opioids laced with fentanyl and other products. The concern was that kids were vaping the vaping things that they were using were not nicotine-based products per se. Or even if they were nicotine-based products, they may have been laced or some other type of product or substance had been introduced into that supply. So those are kind of the global aspects in terms of the significant concerns we have with vaping in general, whether it's nicotine-based or other products. And I will say this, as we've talked about before as well, is that the significant concern about substance use in general in our adolescent and young adult population due to the ease of access to substances. I think it speaks to an underlying significant issue of the need for increased behavioral health services and mental health services to, again, complement the efforts that you all have undertaken to address access to different substances.
Thank you, Dr. Gales. And I think while youth are particularly susceptible to these products, I think there's universal agreement on that. These products are also equally dangerous in adults as well.
Yes, well, the part of the challenge is that we don't have a lot of longitudinal long-term studies that show the clear impact of this. Excuse me. There is, again, early exposure to nicotine is well demonstrated in terms of impairment of the adolescent brain. As has been evidenced in the last 3 months, we've seen an increase of vaping-related respiratory illnesses. There has been a memo released by CDC that has speculated that it is tied to vitamin E additives to vaping liquids, particularly those that are involving some marijuana and synthetic cannabinoids. But we don't know, we don't have clear, we speculate, but we don't have the long-term studies to confirm. But again, part of the challenge with the vaping devices is that the concentration of nicotine is significantly higher within a pod compared to, I think some reference has say that, one pod contains equivalent amount of nicotine of 20 cigarettes. Which is pretty significant. And again, as we've talked about before, there are some folks who jewel just one pod. There are others who go through multiple pods a day. And so, again, while the number of cigarettes decreases in terms of use, the concentration of nicotine exposure is significantly higher.
Thank you. I appreciate that. So we have three bills that we're going to discuss this morning, and one is lead co-sponsored by my colleague, Councilmember Craig Rice. That involves the prevention of the sale of these products within a half mile of middle schools and high schools. There is a second bill that is lead co-sponsored by my colleague Hans Riemer and I, that expands upon that discusses the flavor access. And then there is a third bill that is lead co-sponsored by my colleague Tom Hucker and I, that talks about the provision of the sale of these products, but more in terms of enforcement. Now, the confusing aspect of this is some of this does cross over into our Fed committee because this is a zone text amendment, and so we will be discussing these bills within the provision of our body as the Health and Human Services Committee and our role as the Public Health Board of the overall county. And I want to thank you again, Ms. Myhill, for putting together a packet. What I'd like to do is for us to discuss each three of these bills individually because there are certain components that need to be discussed and adjusted within each one of those. But before we go any further, I'd like to give my colleagues an opportunity to make some opening comments before Ms. Myhill will walk us through the packet. Councilmember Rice.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. And so it's interesting because the conversations that I've had with folks about the concerns about this bill are ones that certainly I can see their point and make complete sense. You know, there are a lot of folks who are, have businesses that are out there with a model that's trying to ensure that folks have an option to get off of smoking. Although we still don't have the numbers as to how many of those successfully actually quit, they may vape rather than, and so that's still better and healthier than smoking. But still, we're not really sure about those numbers and how successful they are at actually getting them to stop, and significant numbers. But that being said, I certainly still understand that one healthier option is better than to smoke. The reality is those products will still be available. For those individuals who want to continue to use vaping as a means of which to get themselves off of smoking, they'll still be able to do that. Still be able to order them online. They'll be able to go into stores that aren't located in a close proximity to schools and get those products. They'll be able to talk to folks in stores that are located in places that aren't close to these schools and still be able to do all the things and provide the great customer service that we heard folks testify about. Those things will still be able to happen. We're not shutting people down. What we're doing is we're trying to restrict access. And I think for us that the key is that when we see so many of our children who have access to these products, and it's not, and I completely understand that we heard the testimony from folks in our business community who say that they're very strict about not letting people in who aren't of legal age. We know it just like we know it from alcohol purchases and other types of things out there, and there have been a lot of conversations about, well, we should do the same thing with alcohol. Well, we're certainly going to take a look at that. One of the criticisms that we get from government is, well, why are you in the alcohol business? One of the reasons we're in the alcohol business is we get to control where they are. We don't have a proliferation of liquor stores like we do in neighboring jurisdictions. They're everywhere if you go into Prince George's County. We don't have close to the number that are there. It's one of the benefits of being able to dictate where those things are. And we do that now. And we understand that there are other competing businesses that don't like it, who think that it doesn't work for them, and we completely understand that. But at the end of the day, we have to make decisions that are trying to ensure the safety of our residents. And so from that perspective, I will tell you, with a child who's in middle school, who goes to Kingsview Middle School, and another who goes to Northwest High School, these are prevalent. These are everywhere, not just in high schools, but in middle schools as well. And it means that they're obtaining these products not just via online, but they're also getting brothers and sisters to purchase them because it's easier for them. And it's not to say that that won't happen still. Those things will still happen. illegal markets will continue to be there, whether you legalize marijuana, whether you do all these kinds of things. All these things will continue to exist. And so we're not being unrealistic in terms of saying that we're not, this isn't some complete panacea. I'm not telling people that, nor do I assume that to be the case. But I do know that restricted access is restricted access. If you make it harder for people to get stuff, it's going to be a lot harder for them to actually use the product and to get it going. And so from that perspective, I would just say that I understand. I get it. As a person who worked for large companies, as a person who's worked with a lot of business industries when it comes to some of the bills, I understand that it sometimes feels as though some of this isn't fair, and it's not your fault. You haven't done anything wrong. For those businesses who are doing the right thing and selling to only adults, you get caught up in what's happening with a lot of other folks who may not be doing the right thing. I will just say this, that when we talk about the aspects of it from a health perspective, and this is something that Dr. Gales and I talked about years ago when Councilmember Leventhal first brought this to the Health and Human Services Committee. The concern then was not just about death, but about the health impacts on individuals as a whole from the vaping itself. That's something that's still yet to be determined in terms of what those impacts may be. The large amount of nicotine is one thing that we've talked about, but we've also talked about some of the other chemicals that are in these products that actually then affect the lungs. And so whether you're an adult or a child, maybe this isn't something you should be doing. Now again, I'm not a doctor, I'm not an FDA or NIH researcher. There's plenty of that that's going on right now, and we'll find out soon. But I would just say and caution folks to simply say, oh, this is completely healthy and there's no problems and there's no issues. I would caution folks about saying that, because they said that about smoking. They used to say that about smoking. That was what folks said then. There are no issues. They said it about a lot of things that we now know are not the case. So from that perspective, I'm certainly going to support these pieces of legislation. Mr. Chair, I'm certainly amenable to what we may do in terms of the council staff had talked about possibly combining two of the bills that are similar together. I'm open to whatever amendments are there technically, but I do think this is the right step for us in the right direction. It is going to benefit our kids in terms of just making our community a little bit of a safer place in terms of restricting access, as we see so many kids who unfortunately are using these products illegally, mind you, but still using them. And we've got to do something about it. So thank you.
Thank you, Councilmember Rice. Councilmember Glass.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I want to applaud your efforts on all three bills, and my colleague, Mr. Rice, as well, for his leadership in this space. I mean, the whole reason we're here is trying to figure out how we protect our kids. And we are not the only elected officials in this country who are trying to answer that question of how we protect our kids. There are vigorous conversations at the federal level. In the White House itself, great debate raging within the FDA, within other federal agencies. We are weeks away from the state legislative session in Annapolis, where this will be brought up. Legislation very similar to ours, minus the ZTA, will be brought up in Annapolis, and I expect it to pass statewide there. And so we are trying to figure out what we can do here at the council, at the county level, to protect our kids, because the data show that smoking rates among our children have been the lowest in generations. And the e-cigarette makers were trying to figure out how to hook kids on nicotine, and it's been documented. And they found their path, and it was with vaping. And they helped promote vaping to our youth, and that's the question that we're trying to resolve today, of how to stop this epidemic from spreading so we don't have generations hooked on nicotine and other problems. And last thing I'll just say before we take up the three pieces is that these types of protections are not new here in Montgomery County. We protect our children from liquor sales by restricting where those stores are. We protect our children from gun sales by restricting where those gun stores are. And today we're discussing whether or not to expand those restrictions and protections to our children by restricting where vape shops are as well. So thank you for your leadership, and Ms. Myhill, thank you.
Okay, Ms. Myhill, let's start with Bill 2919. And Dr. Gales, thank you very much. I think if we have any questions, we'll bring you back up. I think we're going to go over the technical aspects of this. Bill 2919, if you could just give an overview for us, Ms. Myhill, and what are the elements within this piece of legislation that we need to discuss?
Sure. The first piece of legislation, I did want to make an overall comment that while we are talking about the legislation, all of the changes that you make will also be made to the resolutions to adopt Board of Health regulations. And at the end of the work session, if you are comfortable voting out bills, we also need to vote out the resolution so that they can all go as one package to the council. So I wanted to just flag that for you. The first bill that we are talking about in resolution is 2919, which essentially prohibits an electronic smoking devices manufacturer, as it is defined in state law, from distributing any electronic cigarette to a retail store that's within a half a mile of any middle school or high school in the county. I have given you some maps to take a look at just so that you understand the range of buffers that we're talking about. I'm happy to talk to those more specifically if you'd like me to. I did also want to note for you that there's a lot of background material in this packet for the first bill that's not repeated in the other packets. I just referred back to it because it just made more sense to do it that way, and the council has received quite a bit of testimony, generally supportive or in opposition of this package of bills. And so to the extent that it's general testimony, it all appears in the packet for 2919. To the extent any people in testimony or correspondence raised specific issues about specific bills, those are attached to those bills. Similarly, the testimony and correspondence that we received that was specifically directed towards the vape shop ZTA will appear in the packet when the ZTA goes to Fed. So that those pieces of correspondence are not in this packet because that's not what's before this committee. That being said, there were a couple of issues, 3 issues that I've identified, starting on page 2 of the packet that specifically relate to this bill. The first being that the council received a letter that from the American Cancer Society, Heart Association, and Lung Association that urged an amendment to expand this bill to include all tobacco products. My recommendation is not to do that because the council in this measure is responding to specific authority granted by the state. And I think that it is preferable to limit this to the authority that is specifically granted to the county.
I don't have any questions regarding that. That seems reasonable.
Okay, I will. I'm going to skip the second issue because that's going to require more discussion. I want to go to the third issue on page 3 because it's a relatively minor issue. There's a definition in the bill. If you want to take a look at it, it's on circle 2. Oh, I'm sorry. It's in it's on page 3. It's section 24-9 of the code defines an electronic cigarette, and you can read the definition there. Council staff is recommending you tweak that definition a little bit to make it clear that any component or part of an electronic cigarette is within that definition. That makes it consistent with the county's excise tax, and it also makes it consistent with the third bill that you'll talk about today, Bill 32-19.
I think without objection.
Yep.
Yeah.
Okay, and then the only other issue that I've identified you is, as you've talked about, Chair Albornoz, there is some overlap between this bill and Bill 3219. This bill prohibits a manufacturer from distributing electronic cigarettes, which is more broadly defined, within half a mile of middle and high schools, whereas in Bill 3219, it prohibits a manufacturer from distributing only flavored electronic cigarettes, and it's within 1 mile of a broader range of facilities, such as all schools, libraries, parks, playgrounds, and recreational facilities. Staff is supportive of both measures. I'm just looking for guidance from the committee, how you would like to address those. We can certainly combine them. We can keep them separate. From a policy perspective, I'd like to hear what you would like to do, and then we can figure out the right mechanism to do so.
So I'll just start with my thoughts on this. I've been thinking about this a lot. So I think there is no question that the flavors are one of the tools by which the industry has used to hook youth. But there is also obviously an acknowledgement that it's not just youth that are attracted to the particular flavors, but it is undeniably one of the reasons why youth are initially attracted to these products in the first place. And so I think a comprehensive ban on the flavored aspect of these, in my opinion, makes a lot of sense. I have appreciated the testimony that we have heard from vape shop owners in particular and some of the purveyors of those vape shops that have indicated that for them, this has been a positive product in helping them wean off of cigarette use. And while I have had a number of, both through correspondence and conversations, express an interest in an expansion beyond the half a mile to a mile, and to include the definition of all of those other shops, or all of those locations, basically any place a youth may gather, I'm comfortable with the language personally that we have initially professed within the initial bill, which already does make it more than difficult for these particular facilities, and the sale of these specific products within the half mile makes sense to me. So that's how I feel, but I want to open it up for my colleagues to get your thoughts on this as well. Councilmember Rice.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Chair. Excuse me, I'm losing my voice. So when it comes to 3219, as we're talking about the possibility of combining them together, one of the things I am concerned about is that we in Parks and Recreation oftentimes open up parks, play spaces all the time. We don't do it as frequently when it comes to our schools. And so from that perspective, I mean, we do have schools that open up, but not as frequently. And typically they're not in commercial areas. Parks are all over the place. I know we just opened up the Germantown Regional Park, or Germantown Urban Park, that's in Germantown Town Center. And so from that perspective, that's a little bit of a concern, because a person who's invested and gone into these places and then all of a sudden is uprooted, you know, this is where we're starting from here with this legislation. But what I don't want is a continual rolling cycle of folks as we pop up with small parks here and there that negatively impact businesses. So that is my concern. When it comes to recreation facilities or other schools, I'm not as concerned. Those, again, don't pop up, and they're very forward in terms of their planning. They're out there, and not to say that parks aren't, but I mean, the second we open up a park or anything like that, it could have a very negative impact. So that's my only concern with that. So I'd like us to think about that piece of it. When it comes to the recreation centers of the schools, I'm perfectly fine. So,
Councilmember Glass, do you have any thoughts?
Yeah, I appreciate the thoughtfulness of my colleagues' comments regarding more parks and more recreational activities and centers that we continue to build, especially as we talk about the CIP in the coming months and what more the Parks wants to do. But I concur with the chair that there should be a consensus regarding the half mile or mile, and I think the half mile in the original legislation is a good standard because, as has been noted, the goal of this is to protect our kids, and recognizing that adults have the rights and liberties to do as they see fit. I think that half mile is a good buffer to protect our kids.
Great. So, Councilmember Rice, would you then propose an amendment to take out the parks component and keep the recreation centers, libraries, and all of the other structured facilities? And the concern, understandably, is the potential ambiguity of how we define a park. Is that correct?
It would actually be park and playground because, again, a playground, again, if I just think about, and I'm dating myself, but Loman's Plaza that had a little playground area that was in front of it, where my mom went into Loman's, I would play outside. That's a playground area. Well, if those other businesses in the shopping center, so if Loman's or the purveyors set up that playground area, now all of a sudden that business is out. That just seems kind of ambiguous and really isn't what we're trying to do strategically. So I would move to take out the park and the park and playground piece, those two pieces, or tighten up the definition to be more of something that's more substantive than just
brick and mortar.
Yeah, exactly.
Ms. Myhill, any thoughts on that? Seems pretty straightforward.
Yes, I hear where the committee is going, and we can, those are changes that we can make to Bill 32, but I will reemphasize that when we discuss that.
But I still support that.
But it sounds like you would like to keep 2919 the way it is, a half a mile elementary, or I'm sorry, half a mile middle and high schools.
Including private schools.
And yes, this doesn't specify that it's public schools, so it is private and public schools.
Okay, so I think without objection then?
Yep.
Okay. Was there anything else regarding this particular bill, Ms. Myhill?
No, sir.
Okay, then let's move on to the next bill then, which is
I will just ask you
3119.
to also indicate that you are supporting the resolution.
Yes,
Yes.
without objection. Yes.
It may be helpful if the chair is amenable to this to talk about 3219 because they were very similar and
Sure.
So if we go to HHS item number 3, what this bill does, as we've already talked about, is it prohibits an electronic smoking devices manufacturer as defined in state law from distributing flavored electronic smoking or electronic cigarettes to any retail store within a half a mile of elementary, middle, high schools, which is public and private, library, parks, playgrounds, or recreational facility. And from what I have heard from the committee, please correct me if I have it incorrect, is you would prefer that to be a half a mile and to strike park and playground.
That is correct.
The only other issue that I have on this bill is that the American Cancer Society, the Heart Association, and Lung Association had submitted a joint letter to the council urging the council not to move forward with this piece of legislation because they preferred a comprehensive prohibition. And also, instead of doing this, they had recommended that the council support whatever statewide legislation is submitted during the General Assembly session. It is not my recommendation that you wait to do so. The council often leads on these types of issues. Frankly, on a variety of issues, the council often leads. And so I don't have any concerns with the council stepping behind some state legislation, but I don't think that that prohibits the council from exercising authority that it's been given under state law.
So I appreciate that. I think while we hope that the state bills proceed and that they are passed, we don't want to take that chance. And so I, for one, believe that we should continue full speed ahead. And then obviously, if at such time the state bills are enacted, then clearly we will adjust as necessary. But as we've seen at the federal level, I don't want to have what has happened at the federal level to potentially happen at the state level. So that's how I feel. My colleagues feel the same way.
And again, just for clarity's sake, your recommendations on this bill also will apply to the resolution.
Correct. I do want to discuss, just to be absolutely clear, the mile versus the half a mile. The value of adding the half a mile to both is that there then is a clear consistency, which will make it easier for us to be able to enact the legislation. I don't want the message to be that we're somehow attempting to water down that particular measure. will expand greatly when you include elementary schools and those other brick and mortar structures, which would effectively, based on the configurations of the circles of where they are located, make it very difficult to identify any location within the county to be able to sell the flavored products. And so it continues to move forward, but for purposes of consistency in the resolutions, the half a mile makes sense. Great.
And the third bill before you is item number 2, which is Bill 3119, which is entitled Health and Sanitation, Electronic Cigarettes, Distribution, Use, and Possession. What this bill would do is to prohibit the distribution of any tobacco product, coupon redeemable for a tobacco product, cigarette rolling paper, or electronic cigarette to an individual under 21 except for if they're 18 with a military ID. It also would prohibit an individual under 21 from using or possessing a tobacco product or an electronic cigarette, again, except with the military exception. And what this bill does is basically two things. The county already has a prohibition from distributing tobacco products. Right now it says minors, and it had mirrored some state law that was recently changed to increase the minimum age to 21 except for 18 with a military ID. And so the first part of this bill just makes conforming changes to county law to match the state law. The second part of this bill makes it would be against county law for a person who is unable to purchase them themselves to actually use and possess electronic cigarettes and these tobacco products. There are some issues that start on page 2 that I've identified. One I've already spoke to you about, which is the overlap with state law. The American Heart, or the Cancer Society, the American Heart Association, and the Lung Association submitted a joint letter urging certain amendments to the bill to update the tobacco definition to match state law, impose fines on the retailer and not the clerk, and to remove the purchase, use, and possession provisions regarding youth. Regarding the imposition of fines, the Tobacco 21 legislation at the state had specific provisions in the Health General article that specifically said that if a violation is committed by a person acting on behalf of a retailer, the civil penalty shall be paid by the retailer. As you'll see in the packet, I'd had conversations with executive staff, and I understand that when the county issues citations for violating the county law about selling and distributing to minors, it's both the clerk and the retailer that do receive a violation. The clerk receives a lesser monetary penalty than the retailer does, but both are fined because both have contributed to the violation of county law. I think that's a good balance. I don't recommend any changes, but I give that to you for your discussion.
I agree. I think that also feels reasonable, and clearly we did need to adjust to be able to conform and provide consistency in the language, so that is very straightforward. Councilmember Rice, you had your light on.
I just had a real quick question. So, Ms. Myhill, when it comes to the fines, that then goes through, if a person couldn't pay, would go through court, and the court could assign another sort of penalty, community service, et cetera, if they didn't have the money to be able to pay for the fine. Is that not correct?
I can check.
Up to judge's discretion?
Yeah, it would be up to the judge's discretion for the final penalty, but I don't have that specific information, though I can find it for you.
The only reason why I'm asking is because I do know that some of our children whose families may not be able to afford the fine, who are who are doing this, certainly we want to provide an off-ramp for them to understand that there's a penalty associated with it, but still have the ability to do something else that shows that they're certainly learning from their lesson, but still not, affecting them from a negative perspective.
And that's kind of a lead-in into the second part of the letter, that if there are no other questions on, or if there's a concurrence with the staff comments on the first issue, we can go into the second.
Without objection. Yep.
Okay. So state criminal law formally prohibited a minor from using or possessing a tobacco product or an electronic cigarette. And as you know, the Tobacco 21 legislation, this part of it was repealed. So, which is the reason for Bill 3119. The letter had urged the council to remove the provisions that prohibited youth from possessing and using these products, partially because, for the reasons you just mentioned, Mr. Rice, not everyone who is cited, the youth may not be able to afford it, and then they're kind of swept up into the criminal justice system, which is not necessary.
Right.
And so to address those concerns, as I understand it, these are important tools for the county to be able to, steer youth into programs that may help them. And so in order to address this concern about the criminal justice aspect of it, the lead sponsors are recommending an amendment to specify that the monetary fine is $0, but that way it still gives the enforcing agency an opportunity to confiscate those products and steer the youth into, better programs. But it does avoid the criminal justice aspect of it.
So I appreciate that was an excellent overview, Ms. Myhill. After having initially discussed this with the other lead co-sponsor of this, Tom Hucker, it was brought to our attention the potential unintended consequence of moving forward with the measure as it was written. And so I do believe striking a reasonable balance is important because we don't want to create more problems than we're trying to solve with regards to this issue. And so I do think the proposal of lowering the monetary fine to $0 for youth that are caught within possession, but still providing a mechanism for enforcement officials to be able to confiscate the devices as they find them, and there still be a citation associated with this, so that there is an acknowledgement that there needs to be tools in the tools box to when a youth does move forward with this product. But I think this strikes the balance. And so I don't know if my colleagues have any questions or thoughts or comments. Councilmember Glass.
I appreciate the comments that had been put forth and the revisions that are here. I agree with that, because what we're trying to do is use that as a teachable moment for our students. And we don't want punitive action that would otherwise adversely harm them.
Councilmember Rice.
So I'm a little torn here because I, brought up the idea about the fine, but I still think that something in the sense of, besides the confiscation makes sense. I just don't have what that would be. I don't know if do we have other types of penalties that are in place to deal with just solely community service on a local level from a civil citation standpoint?
No, typically in our law, we have 3 different levels of fines. There's something is either a class A, B, or C violation. I don't know how often the county actually issues criminal citations. To the extent that they do, it's a monetary fine and can be time in jail. This is not a criminal violation under county law. I want to make that completely clear. But in terms of county law violations for civil penalties, it ranges from a class C violation, which is most of Chapter 24, is a $50 fine for initial offense or $75 for a repeat. But there's no, I can't think of, I don't have the entire code memorized, but I can't think of an instance in which we have, identified something as community service as opposed to a monetary fine. I think it's always a monetary fine. And I will say, just, trying to address the sensitivity about the criminal justice aspects of it, it's also quite unusual to specify that that the fine is $0. Usually we're trying to increase those, but because of the specific nature of this, that's why this is it's an interesting balancing act.
Yeah. Okay, I'm fine with it.
Councilmember Glass.
Along those lines, what actions can be taken currently for youth who are either caught with alcohol or smoking cigarettes or anything like that?
I can check those for you.
Because it appears that's what we're trying to figure out. What are the consistent actions that we can take to try and stop these?
Sure. Well, the Tobacco 21 legislation did repeal the use and that's why we're doing this bill. So under state law, there won't be any penalties associated with using these products any longer. When it comes to alcohol, that's totally a state law concern, and so I will check with them and I can get back to you about that.
Okay, thank you.
So I think it sounds like without objection, then we'll proceed with the 0, but we will get more information, and if at such time we need to amend when we go before full council, we can do that. But for purposes of moving forward out of committee, we'll go with the recommendation as is laid out.
The other item that is in the packet for you that was raised in testimony was, as I've told you, this bill mirrors and conforms the county law to the state tobacco 21, where it raises the minimum age to 21, except if you're 18 with a military ID and are in active duty. And someone had submitted testimony suggesting that we remove that exception. Like I said, we're trying to mirror state law in county law, so I wouldn't recommend that you do so, but.
I concur. Yep, without objection. Councilmember Rice.
So on a separate note, if we're done with those two issues, I just have one about, is there a grace period as a part of this distribution piece, or is it effective immediately? What?
So this is not an expedited bill, so it takes, there's never an easy answer from me, right? This is.
That's all right. That's okay.
This is not an expedited bill, so it takes effect 91 days after it becomes law. It becomes a law either on the executive signature, him returning it unsigned, or if he vetoes a piece of legislation after the council overrides the veto. So roughly about 100 days after action.
And this distribution applies to everyone, so it applies to vape shops, convenience stores, gas stations.
Yes, but keep in mind that the Tobacco 21 legislation is already in effect. So already stores cannot sell to under 21 or 18 with a military ID. So this is, like I said, mirroring state law, but the state law took effect in October.
Okay.
Okay. Anything else, Ms. Myhill, with regards to
No,
that?
the only thing that I would just, I would be happy if you would do is just confirm that you are voting all of the resolutions and bills out, just so that it's crystal clear.
Yes, we will do that. I'll ask that that language be included in a motion from one of my colleagues.
So moved.
Second.
Okay. Just a quick discussion here. Want to thank everybody who has testified and who has presented information that has been very helpful throughout this process. As you've heard from all of my colleagues and all of my colleagues on the council, it's the public health of our youth that we're most concerned about. And the numbers are stark and alarming and require immediate action from this body. And as Councilmember Glass mentioned, this is being discussed across the entire country. And so raise your hands if you agree with the motion as presented, and that is unanimous. Thank you, Ms. Myhill. And we are adjourned for this morning.